Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. If you haven't already done so, please make sure the volume of this podcast is set perfectly to your listening enjoyment. Please take your seat, whether that's on the treadmill, car, sofa, or bed, and buckle in for the last trip. My name is Jamie Beebe, and I'll be your tour guide, recreating someone's last days in paradise. On behalf of myself and everyone behind the scenes, please enjoy the Last Trip podcast. And because nobody likes a long flight to get to where they want to be, let's prepare for takeoff. "24-year-old Ryan Chicovsky was living abroad teaching English in China and spending his free time doing what so many young travelers dream of, exploring Southeast Asia. In March 2006, he took a vacation to Laos. It was supposed to be a short getaway. Ryan was last seen leaving the Khemkong Guesthouse in Xiangkong, a remote river village in northwestern Laos. He walked out, and then nothing. No confirmed sightings, no messages, no explanation. Just silence in a place where help is far away and questions are hard to answer. What happened after Ryan stepped out of that guest house door? Before we can understand how someone disappears there, we have to understand where there is. Xiangkok isn't a major city. It isn't a crowded tourist hub with cameras on every corner. It's a small, remote river village in northwestern Laos. Quiet, beautiful, and far removed from the infrastructure most travelers rely on. When people think about Southeast Asia, Laos doesn't always come to mind first. It's quieter than Thailand, less fast-paced than Vietnam. It's landlocked, heavily mountainous, and stitched together by rivers, especially the Mekong River, which runs like a spine along much of the country's western edge. Laos has a complicated history. French colonialism in the late 1800s. Then, decades later, becoming heavily bombed during the secret war tied to the Vietnam conflict. Even now, unexploded ordnance still exists in parts of the countryside. And yet, despite that past, the country is often described as serene, spiritual, slow. 70% of Laos is mountainous. Roads wind around steep green hills. Villages sit along riverbanks. Buddhist temples mark the center of community life. People farm, fish, and live close to the land. It's the kind of place where mornings are misty and quiet, where monks walk barefoot collecting alms and long-tail boats idle along muddy banks. And that quiet is part of the appeal. Travelers, especially backpackers, English teachers on break, gap-year students, are drawn to northern Laos because it feels untouched, less commercial, more authentic. It's where you go when you want to unplug, when you want the noise to stop. For Ryan Chicovsky, a 24-year-old American teaching English in China, that kind of place probably felt like exactly the right stop for vacation. This isn't a place with high-rise hotels or constant traffic. It's wooden homes on stilts, dirt paths, a handful of small shops, maybe a local market. Everyone tends to know everyone else. When foreigners pass through, they're noticeable. Not in a hostile way necessarily, but simply because they're few. In a place like that, community is tight, but resources are limited. There aren't embassies down the street. There aren't major hospitals within minutes. There aren't cameras on every corner. If something happens, response time can be slow. Language barriers can complicate things. And when you're dealing with an international disappearance, those layers multiply. Different legal systems, different governments, different expectations. Remoteness is part of the magic, and part of the risk. For someone like Ryan, living overseas already, comfortable navigating foreign environments, Xiangkok may have felt peaceful, a place to rest before returning to his teaching job in China. But on March 13th, 2006, that peaceful setting became the backdrop to his disappearance. Before he became a headline, before his name was attached to the word missing, Ryan Chicovsky was just Ryan. He was born on May 3rd, 1981, and grew up in Mount Vernon, Washington, a small town surrounded by farmland and mountain views in the Pacific Northwest. If you've been there, you know the rhythm. Gray skies in the winter, tulip fields in the spring, Friday night games, the kind of place where families tend to know each other. Ryan's parents, Dave and Judy, raised 3 kids there: Ryan, his sister Tasha, and his brother Keenan. At home, he wasn't the missing traveler in Laos. He was a son, a brother, the kid who probably teased his siblings and then defended them. The one who left muddy shoes by the door and had big ideas about the world beyond Skagit County. Growing up, his friends called him Cheeks. It's the kind of nickname that tells you something right away. He wasn't distant. He wasn't unapproachable. He was known, liked, part of a circle. People who knew Ryan describe him as sharp and genuinely intelligent, the kind of student who didn't just memorize material, but understood it. At Western Washington University, he studied political science. Now that alone tells you something about him. He was curious about systems, about governments, about how the world works. But during his senior year, almost on a whim, he enrolled in an introductory Chinese class as an elective. He hadn't studied Mandarin before. It wasn't part of some lifelong plan. It was just an interest. And then something clicked. Within a year, after taking classes through Western's Modern Classical Languages department, Ryan secured an opportunity that most students would only dream about. The department allowed him to travel abroad to China after just 1 year of study, something that normally takes much longer preparation. And he didn't go alone. He traveled alongside Janet Singh, a Chinese language associate professor at Western Washington University. And under her guidance, he studied abroad in China. And here's the part that stands out. Ryan didn't speak much Chinese when he arrived, but he immersed himself. He dove in completely. Within a month, he was fluent enough to navigate comfortably. That's not casual intelligence. That's discipline, adaptability, confidence in unfamiliar environments. And he wasn't just book smart, he was bold. After his study abroad program, many students would have returned home, degree in hand, and started job hunting. But at his sister Tasha's graduation dinner on June 10th, 2005, Ryan shared something bigger. He'd found a job in China, and he wasn't coming straight back. He was staying. Now you can imagine that dinner. The clinking of glasses, the pride, the surprise, maybe a little worry from his parents. The realization that their son wasn't just taking a short adventure. He was building a life halfway around the world. Now, Ryan had always wanted to travel across Asia, but not just the postcard version. He wasn't chasing resort towns or curated tourist experiences. He wanted rural Asia. He wanted villages, dirt roads, grassroots communities. He wanted to see what daily life looked like beyond capital cities and high-rises. He wanted to understand culture at its most basic level, to see people at their barest, as those who knew him described it. To get back to basics. Now that tells you something important about who Ryan was. He wasn't looking for luxury. He was looking for authenticity, for connection, for immersion. His first stop in that broader dream of exploring Asia beyond the surface was Laos, specifically rural Laos. Not the polished stops, but the real places, which is what makes his disappearance so difficult to reconcile. This wasn't someone reckless. This wasn't someone naive to life abroad. This was a politically minded, intellectually curious young man who had already proven he could adapt to foreign languages and foreign systems. He was a son. He was Cheeks. He was the brother who announced over dinner that he'd decided to stay overseas and chase something bigger. And in March of 2006, in a small river village in Laos, that dream collided with uncertainty. When we talk about missing persons cases, it's easy for geography to take center stage. The maps, the timeline, the unanswered logistics. But at the center of this story is a 24-year-old man from Mount Vernon who believed the world was meant to be understood up close. Ryan wasn't just passing through Asia. He was trying to know it. And somewhere along that journey, the trail stopped. On the evening of March 13th, 2006, Ryan walked out of the Khemkong Guesthouse and into the warm night air along the Mekong. The guesthouse owner saw him leave his room alone. He was wearing a shirt, shorts, and sandals. He had his camera with him. Nothing seemed unusual. In a place like Xiangkok, evenings are for wandering. You can walk down to the river. You can take photos as the sky turns violet. You can find a small place to eat, talk to other travelers. You come back later. But Ryan didn't come back. The next morning, when his travel companions came to his room, as accounts say, he may have been traveling with a Dutch man who had a limp and possibly a Japanese woman. He wasn't there. The plan had been to travel down the Mekong River together on March 14th. But Ryan's bed had not been slept in. His backpack was still there, along with his clothes, his passport, his money, his boots, his toiletries. Everything you would need to leave a country, or survive it, remained inside that modest riverside room. The guesthouse owner didn't immediately report it. In a remote village where backpackers move fluidly, disappear for days, trek into hill tribe territory, or rent a room as kind of a home base, it wasn't unheard of for someone to be gone a night or two. Maybe he'd gone hiking, camping, or simply extended his wandering. But 2 days later, realizing Ryan still hadn't returned, the owner notified local police. And here's where the realities of rural Laos become painfully relevant. The local authorities in Xiangkok never handled a missing tourist case before. The town only had a few hundred residents. Crime is rare, infrastructure is limited, resources are minimal. Officers reportedly traveled by foot because the entire province only had one truck available to the force. On March 17th, the local police notified provincial authorities because they didn't have the capacity to manage an international missing persons investigation. But there was another critical delay. The disappearance was not immediately reported to the U.S. Embassy, which should have been standard procedure in a case involving an American citizen. It wasn't until March 29th that the embassy was officially notified. And on March 31st, Ryan's parents, Dave and Judy, got the call. They were supposed to see their son in just 3 days. They actually had plans to meet him in Hong Kong. Ryan was planning to travel down to Vietnam and then fly north to meet them. It had been over a year since they'd seen him, and they were all looking forward to it. So instead of flying to Hong Kong for a reunion, Dave and Judy flew to Laos to search for their son. They would remain on the ground for about a month that first trip. While they were there, on April 7th, nearly 3 weeks after Ryan disappeared, something surfaced. Members of the Aka tribe, an ethnic minority group living in stilted bamboo homes in remote villages surrounding Xiangkok, discovered items along the Mekong shore about 4 kilometers north of town. They found Ryan's camera, his room key, a Western Washington University volleyball jersey, the one he'd reportedly been wearing the night he left. Now, 4 kilometers is not a short walk, especially at night, in sandals, along uneven terrain. If Ryan had walked that far himself, why leave his belongings there? Why leave his camera? Even more unsettling, despite rainy weather, the camera was not waterlogged. The jersey, it was clean, and the room key was not rusted. Authorities told the family they believed the items may have been planted. And when the Chicovskys accessed the camera's memory card, every photo was still there. Village scenes, people Ryan had met, children he'd interacted with and taught. There were no fatal, ominous images, no accidental clues, just the life he had been living. Then, there was an early reported sighting of a man asking for food and money near the Laos-Vietnam border. For a brief moment, hope flickered. But soon after the investigation, it was determined not to be Ryan. And from there, the trail went cold. Dave and Judy refused to let it end there. They returned to Laos 5 times in that first year. They funded searches. They paid for local police travel, covering gas, food, lodging, anything needed to keep officers looking. They printed flyers. They offered a $5,000 reward for information. Judy emailed the U.S. Embassy constantly. She corresponded for hours with anyone willing to help. And this had to be done. Not because Laos didn't care, but because Laos didn't have the resources. Using the photos recovered from Ryan's camera, the family tracked down villages he had captured in his images. They went to the Hmong and Aka communities. They showed the pictures. They asked questions. Now, some people were reluctant to talk. Others remembered him. Some of the girls at a local Hmong school recalled the young American who visited and handed out pencils. They remembered him fondly. Because that's who Ryan was in their memory. The foreign teacher who showed up with small gifts and curiosity. And yet, despite everything, despite the searches, the interviews, the embassy involvement, the family's relentless presence, there have never been verified sightings of Ryan after the night he left the Khemkong Guesthouse. No confirmed evidence of where he went, no remains, no explanation. Just that quiet river village, a camera found miles away, and a family who was 3 days away from hugging their son for the first time in over a year. Now, some disappearances come with answers we don't like. Others come with no answers at all. For Dave, for Judy, for Tasha, for Keenan, for the friends who once called him Cheeks, the silence is the hardest part. Because without answers, there's no ending. Just the enduring, painful space between hope and grief, and the lingering question of what happened to a young man who walked out into the night with a camera in his hand and never came back. When a case has no body, no witnesses, no confession, what you're left with are possibilities. And possibilities can be dangerous. They can spiral. They can overwhelm families. They can turn grief into speculation. But in a case like Ryan's, where there have been no confirmed sightings since the night of March 13th, 2006, theories are all anyone has. So let's walk through them carefully, respectfully, because behind each theory is a family still listening for answers. The most common explanation offered in rural disappearances cases is the simplest: an accident. Now, the Mekong River in northwestern Laos is powerful. The banks can be steep and unstable. In March, water levels fluctuate. There are rocks, sudden drop-offs, thick brush along edges. At night, in sandals with limited lighting, it wouldn't be hard to slip. And if someone fell into the Mekong, recovery is far from guaranteed. The river is long, the currents are strong. Search capabilities in that region are very limited. So, on its face, it's plausible. Ryan leaves his camera, walks along the riverbank, loses footing, falls in, and the river carries him away. But then there are the belongings found 4 kilometers north. If this were purely accidental, how did his camera, jersey, and key end up together on shore? And why were they reportedly clean despite rainy weather? How was the camera undamaged? Authorities reportedly suggested the items may have been planted. That alone complicates the accident theory. If Ryan had slipped and drowned, the river might conceal him. But the staging, if that's what it was, introduces another layer: foul play. In remote regions, violent crime is statistically low, particularly in small river villages like Xiangkong. But low does not mean non-existent. Ryan was a foreigner. He stood out. He had a camera, visible and potentially valuable. It's not unreasonable to consider robbery as a possibility. Although, notably, his passport, money, and most of his belongings were left behind in his room. If someone targeted him, it likely wasn't premeditated in any large-scale way. Could there have been a confrontation, a dispute, An opportunistic encounter that escalated? The planted belongings, if we accept that assessment, suggest deliberation. Someone wanting to create distance between the location of an incident and where his items were found. 4 kilometers is not a casual stroll in the dark. If someone moved those items intentionally, that implies time, purpose, awareness. But here's the complication. Rural Laos is tight-knit. Outsiders are noticeable. Major crimes are rare. And there's no history of missing tourists in that village. Would an incident like that have remained completely silent in a community of only a few hundred people? Possible, but difficult. Another theory is that Ryan left voluntarily to start a new life, to leave everything behind. Now, this is the theory families often fear most, not because it's likely, but it implies choice. Now, there has been no evidence Ryan planned to vanish. He left behind his passport, his money, his backpack. He was scheduled to meet his parents in Hong Kong just days later, a reunion he was looking forward to. That's not the behavior of someone starting over. He had a job, he had family plans, he had future travel mapped out. Voluntary disappearances requires logistics. Ryan left in his sandals with only his camera. It just doesn't align. Another theory? Getting lost, succumbing to the elements. Northern Laos is rural not just aesthetically, but geographically. Dense forests, hill tribe regions, limited roadways, unmapped paths. It's possible Ryan ventured farther than he intended, hiking, exploring, taking photos, and he became lost or injured. Search capabilities in that province were extremely limited. The Chicovskys reportedly helped cover basic expenses like gas, food, just to sustain search efforts. In that kind of terrain, it would not be impossible for someone to become disoriented. But again, the belongings found together complicate that. If he were lost inland, why are key items found along the riverbank north of town? Now, the part that lingers for me is the condition of the found items. The camera was functioning, the jersey was clean, and the key was not rusted. Rain had fallen, lots of it. If those objects had been sitting exposed for weeks, we would expect more wear, more evidence of the elements. It suggests, though does not prove, that they hadn't been there long. And if that's true, that means someone placed them. That shifts the case from tragic mystery to potential intervention. Ryan's parents have done everything humanly possible, constantly traveling to Laos, funding search efforts, interviewing villagers using photos recovered from his own camera, offering a reward, emailing the embassy consistently. They have replayed every theory more times than any of us ever will. I cannot imagine the psychological toll of not knowing. If there was evidence of an accident, you would grieve. If there was proof of a crime, you would grieve and seek justice. But when there's nothing, no confirmed sighting, no remains, no definitive explanation, you hover in a suspended state. And I think that's where this case lives. In my personal opinion, and it's only an opinion, the planted belongings, if accurately described, make accidental drowning less convincing. The lack of logistical preparation makes voluntary disappearance highly unlikely. So that leaves either an unexplained accident far from town that coincidentally aligns with staged items, or foul play that no one has spoken about. In a village where crime is rare and resources are thin, the truth might simply have slipped through the cracks of geography and capacity. Sometimes the scariest answer isn't a dramatic conspiracy. It's something that happened in the dark, in a quiet place where there were no cameras, no systems, and no means to fully uncover it. Ryan walked out with a camera in his hand. He had plans to see his parents. He had dreams of seeing rural Asia at his barest. Instead, the barest reality is this: no one knows what happened. And for the people who love him, not knowing is its own kind of haunting. When people hear about Ryan's disappearance, the first question many ask is Laos safe? And the honest answer is yes. And also, it depends. Laos is widely considered one of the safer countries in Southeast Asia. Government travel advisories, including those from the US Department of State and the UK Foreign Office, generally describe Laos as a place where violent crime against tourists is uncommon. Petty theft can happen, especially in larger towns. But statistically, the country maintains relatively low reported rates of serious crime compared to many global destinations. For most travelers, Laos is remembered as peaceful, slow, spiritual. Villages centered around temples, families farming rice, children riding bikes down dusty roads. Foreigners often describe feeling welcome. But here's the nuance. Low crime doesn't automatically equal low risk. In remote areas like where Ryan disappeared, the risk doesn't necessarily come from widespread violence. It comes from isolation, from limited infrastructure, from the reality that if something does go wrong, there may not be a system built to respond quickly. Rural Laos is stunning. The mountains are steep, the Mekong River is powerful and wide, and in some stretches, the banks are uneven and unstable. At night, lighting can be sparse. Medical facilities outside major cities are basic. Police departments often operate with extreme limited resources. In some areas, sharing a single vehicle across an entire province. And this is not a criticism of the people there. It's simply the reality of a developing nation with limited funding and decades of historical challenges. When Ryan walked out of the guest house that night, he wasn't stepping into chaos. He was stepping into silence. But quiet places can be unforgiving. Most travel advisories for Laos suggest exercising increased caution, particularly in remote areas and along borders. Not because the country is dangerous, but because help is far away. Search capabilities, language barriers. If someone disappears in a small village of a few hundred people, there's no surveillance systems, digital tracking networks, or large investigative teams ready to deploy. And we also have to talk about the river. Globally, accidental drowning remains one of the leading causes of death for travelers in rural environments. The Mekong, especially in northern Laos, is not a gentle stream. Currents shift, banks crumble, boats move without heavy regulation. Walking alone along its edge at night in sandals carries risk, even in a place considered statistically safe. There are also the broader, less visible risks that affect travelers anywhere in the world. Alcohol safety, road conditions that may not meet Western standards, long stretches between towns without reliable cell service. Now, these aren't crimes, they're vulnerabilities. Ryan was intelligent, seasoned abroad, not reckless. But even seasoned travelers operate within the systems available to them. One thing his case underscores is how important preparation is when traveling in remote regions. Registering your travel with your embassy, letting people know your itinerary, keeping copies of documents separate from originals, being cautious after dark in unfamiliar rural terrain, understanding where the nearest hospital actually is, not just assuming one will be there. None of these precautions guarantee safety, and that's the hardest part. Laos is, by most measures, a welcoming and gentle country. Millions of travelers move through it without incident. But it's also a place where infrastructure is lean and geography is powerful. Ryan's story doesn't mean Laos is unsafe. It means remote travel carries different kinds of risks than we're used to at home. And in a quiet village along the Mekong River on a warm March night, the difference between safe and prepared may matter more than we realize. For Ryan, the systems that might have caught a disappearance quickly simply weren't there. And once silence settles in a place like that, it's very hard to break. On March 13, 2006, Ryan Chicovsky was 24 years old. Brown hair, blue eyes, 5 foot 11 inches and about 155 pounds. A young American teaching English overseas. A son, a brother, a friend. A man who walked out of a guest house in Xiangkok, Laos, and never came back. There have been no confirmed sightings of Ryan since that night. If you were in Laos in March of 2006, if you were traveling through Xiangkok, if you remember a young American man carrying a camera along the Mekong, if you heard something that once felt insignificant, it may not be. If you have any information, no matter how small, you can contact the U.S. Embassy in Laos at 856-21267-000. Ryan would be in his 40s now. His family is still waiting for answers. And until that silence is broken, Ryan's story and the search for truth continues. And finally, remember to leave a review and rate this podcast 5 stars if you like the show, or hell, even if you don't. But either way, feel free to let me know what you think. Please follow The Last Trip on Instagram at The Last Trip Crime Pod, and subscribe on Patreon to support the show. You'll get extra research, videos, photos, and updates, and even learn more about my personal travels. That's patreon.com/The Last Trip Podcast. I'm Jamie Beebe, bringing you your last trip and signing off until the next one. Thanks for listening.